The fight for voting rights. Voting. It's one of the most basic rights of every American. That's because the United States is a democracy. That means just about any U.S. citizen who is at least 18 years old can register or sign up to vote for our government leaders. But this wasn't always the case. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. Back then, only white men who were 21 and older and owned land or businesses were allowed to vote. At the time, that was only about 6% of the U.S. population. For the next 150 years, people fought to change that. In 1870, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution granted voting rights to formerly enslaved African American men. Women were granted suffrage, or the right to vote, in 1920, when the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was adopted. 4 years later, American Indians born in the U.S. got that right. Before that, they weren't even considered citizens. It wasn't easy for these groups to gain suffrage. Women, for example, battled for decades to be able to cast their ballots. Suffragists like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Alice Paul, and thousands of others marched and protested, often while being violently attacked. Many were even jailed for protesting or trying to vote. And even when African Americans and American Indians did win the right to vote, many weren't allowed to exercise it. Some people didn't want African Americans to have a say in our government. Many states, especially in the South, created unfair laws that made it nearly impossible for Black people to vote. Some Black voters were forced to pay poll taxes, or fees for registering to vote, that they couldn't afford. Others were required to take literacy tests that were purposely confusing. And some white officials even used violence to keep African Americans from registering to vote. Finally, after years of pain and sacrifice, the U.S. passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It eliminated those unfair restrictions. And in 1971, the voting age was lowered to 18, marking the last major change to voting rights in the U.S. Not everyone in the world has the chance to vote. In many other countries, people continue to fight for voting rights to this day. Voting doesn't mean everyone always gets what they want, but it at least gives them the opportunity to make their voices heard. You may be too young to vote, but you can still make a difference. Now that you know about the struggle for suffrage, talk to the adults in your life about the importance of voting.
Now that we watched that video, I would like for us to read a story about Alice Paul. You may use these minutes in your reading log, and then we'll answer some questions at the end. Our story is she grew up to fight for women's rights. Alice Paul sat in a filthy jail cell in Virginia. The year was 1917. The blanket on Paul's bed hadn't been washed in months, and the food was crawling with bugs. What crime had landed Paul in that awful place? She had been protesting for the right to vote. Though suffrage is a basic right in a democracy, women in the United States gained that right only 100 years ago. And it took decades of struggle by activists like Paul to make it happen. Let's remember what the word suffrage means. It is the right to vote. And an activist, a person who works to make sure that everyone has equal rights. In our first few paragraphs, Paul is jailed because she is fighting for the right to vote. Next subheading, where it all began. Paul was born in New Jersey in 1885. Her family belonged to a religious group called the Quakers. They believed that men and women were equals. At the time, many Americans did not share that view. Growing up, Paul was taught that she had a responsibility to try to peacefully change injustices in society. Paul's upbringing set the stage for her life's work. After college, she became a leader in the women's suffrage movement. In March 1913, Paul helped organize a protest parade in Washington, D.C. More than 5,000 suffragists marched to the White House. The march drew a huge crowd, including many people who didn't support the cause. Angry onlookers shouted insults and pushed and tripped the marchers, but they wouldn't be stopped. The parade brought visibility to the suffrage movement, says Krista Niles. She works at the Alice Paul Institute. A tough battle. Over the next few years, Paul wrote letters to Congress, gave speeches, and spread the word about her cause. Then, in 1917, she organized a group of more than 1,000 women to protest at the White House. No one had ever dared to protest outside the president's home before. For 8 hours a day, rain or shine, groups of women took turns standing silently outside the White House gates. They held signs with messages such as, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" After a few months, the police began to arrest the protesters. Although they were standing quietly on the sidewalk, more than 200 suffragists were charged with blocking traffic. That's how Paul ended up in that filthy jail cell. Winning the vote. As word spread about their imprisonment, sympathy and support for the suffragists grew. The women were eventually released. More importantly, they could no longer be ignored. Feeling pressured, Woodrow Wilson announced his support for the women's suffrage in 1918. 2 years later, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified, or officially approved. Women in the U.S. were finally granted the right to vote. Until her death in 1977, Paul continued fighting for equal rights for women. Alice Paul believed that one person can make a difference, Niles says. You don't have to be wealthy or famous. It comes down to your personal courage. Words to know: suffrage, the right to vote. Activists, people who use or support strong actions such as protests to help make changes in society. Another word that we were given in the last heading, winning the vote, was ratified. Ratified, using context clues, words within the sentence, means officially approved. Now, let's look at our questions. What is the main idea of the article? A. Alice Paul went to jail for her beliefs. B. Women weren't always allowed to vote. C. Paul played an important part in women gaining the right to vote. D. Voting is one of our basic rights. Let's eliminate 2. Let's eliminate D. Voting is one of our basic rights. While that's true, it is not what this article is about. And let's also eliminate B. Women weren't always allowed to vote. While this is again true, it is not what this article is about. The article is about Alice Paul. Is it more about Alice Paul going to jail or Alice Paul helping gain the right to vote? It is C. Number 5. Which statement is supported by the article? A. Paul started the voting rights movement. B. The voting age should be lowered to 16. C. The fight for voting rights ended after the 19th Amendment was ratified. D. A person doesn't need to be famous to help bring about change in society. Let's eliminate 2. Eliminate A, because Paul did not start the voting rights movement, though she was a part of it. Let's also eliminate B, because voting age is not 16. The fight for voting rights maybe did end after the amendment was ratified, but we do notice in our last paragraph that now says a person does not have to be famous to help bring about change. So our answer is D. And finally, C. What is suffrage? When we looked at our words to know, and even when we mentioned our prior knowledge about civil rights and the right to vote, we know that the answer is C. But let's check the other answers. A. Suffering for a cause. B. Being put in jail. D. The right to protest. We would immediately eliminate B. Being put in jail. Suffering for a cause is a good choice, as well as the right to protest. But these protesters and those suffering were always fighting for the right to vote. C. I hope that you've enjoyed this video. We'll have another one on tomorrow. Have a great day, kids.